Welcome to a late night My Rules Are Better recording. I thought I needed to record something associated with the lunchtime meeting with Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. I'm also going to record a separate podcast about Fighting Fantasy Fest 3, and I will also record another podcast associated with my experience in game stores. And I think this is probably going to be a simulcast My Rules Are Better, probably a long funk My Rules Are Better simulcast. But I wanted to get something recorded because I've been back from the UK a week plus a day. I kind of feel like I'm recovered from the jet lag, but I'm not really recovered from the jet lag. It was a pretty intensive period based on, I think, summer light. I think summer light to summer light makes jet lag more problematic. Traveling with someone certainly makes jet lag more problematic as well. But I saw Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone on the fourth day of travel. So I arrived about an hour early for the lunch, just to get a sense of Hammersmith as a place. There was a coffee shop a few doors down from the Indian restaurant where I was to have lunch with them, and I sat outside the coffee shop and just enjoyed the weather. It was a not hot, but reasonable temperature day, and I just contemplated where I was. Now, Google gave me some bad information. Google told me that the original Games Workshop store was in fact 1.5 miles away. Turned out not to be the case, but I'll get to that. So I just sat there and comprehended what I was doing and thought about, what these two gentlemen had created. I originally was going to go with just a copy of Warlock of Firetop Mountain to be signed, but Ian Livingstone insisted that I bring more things to be signed, so I brought an old white dwarf where both Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson were editors, a copy of Warlock magazine, and 3 fighting fantasy books: Warlock of Firetop Mountain, Time Traveller, and Freeway Fighter. And these, Time Traveller and Freeway Fighter had particular impact on me. I think Appointment with Fear was another book that I was thinking of bringing, but just didn't because I thought, 5 was enough. So I had them set on the table. I went to the Indian restaurant a little bit early, sat my books down, and just contemplated things. Steve Jackson arrived about 5 minutes after I arrived at the Indian restaurant, so we were both early. And I had a wonderful chat with him. It was wonderful just sitting down and rapping with him. I gave them both copies of Beyond the Little Blue Box, which is the John Draper Crunch autobiography that I had some role in editing, because I know they're both interested in the history of technology. And the discussion that I had with Ian Livingstone early on just talked a little bit about that book, talked a little bit about who I was in the context of my work and things like that. I mentioned My Rules Are Better a couple of times through the lunch, in particular talking about how fathers and sons are now playing D&D. That is a phenomena. And just talking about, what had happened really in the past 2-3 years, in large part due to things like Stranger Things and also Bandersnatch, both of which are Netflix properties. Bandersnatch I've had more to do with than Stranger Things. But, just the context of where things are currently. When Ian Livingstone arrived, he was a little hungover. He'd been up late, and he kind of apologised for that. And through the meal, he was constantly getting text messages and these kind of things. Constantly the phone was vibrating. And he showed us a few photos of the new Fighting Fantasy miniatures, and really they talked a lot more about Fighting Fantasy than they did about the early Games Workshop. I raised a few names with them. They didn't, the whole discussion associated with Games Workshop as psychedelia doesn't relate to what they were writing about. They were writing about 1975 to 1985. And all the stuff associated with Citadel Miniatures, that's for a different book. So all the creative artist folks like Kev Adams and John Blanche and all these folks will be, if it is written in a different book, not written by Jackson and Livingstone, but probably written by other folk. I realised that I'd communicated with Alan Merritt. Alan Merritt is probably the fellow that would do it, but he's currently full-time retired. And once that was framed, that the book was just about the early days of Games Workshop, not about the miniatures, not about Warhammer, not about 40k, not about any of that, just the whole thing that was initially importing D&D and, that TSR UK, all that stuff that happened. So when I realised that this was going to be a very different lunch than I had originally thought about. And I guess I'd come to that realisation before actually going to the lunch, but I just wanted to see how far into, Brian Ansell, Citadel Miniatures, the move to Nottingham, all this kind of stuff. And they weren't really interested in that. So it was an interesting lunch that framed both of them as very distinct characters. And certainly in terms of their work after the Fighting Fantasy books, they went in completely different directions. I mean, both exploring computer games, but just doing it in different ways. And what I found nice was that they were still friends. They're still a part of a board game group that meets on a semi-regular basis. And they had a great degree of friendship for one another, which I thought was genuinely wonderful. I mean, to have collaborated and gone separate ways and, these kind of things, and obviously being brought back primarily for Fighting Fantasy related stuff, not so much for Games Workshop, because Games Workshop is a functioning entity that continues on. So there were small opportunities to perhaps make a pitch for one or both of them appearing on this podcast, and I thought it was probably better that I just have an experience that was framed very much in me donating to this book project. And as it turned out afterwards, I got in contact with Alan Merritt and put him back in contact with Ian Livingstone to contribute to the Diceman book, which is the history of Games Workshop 75 to 85. The meal concluded, and one of them made the point that the store, the original Games Workshop store, was actually round the corner. So I wandered round the corner with Steve Jackson while Ian Livingstone went to get his car. They were going to drive. They both were close to where I was staying, but I just felt, let them drive together and talk about Fighting Fantasy Fest in a couple of days. I didn't need to be, omnipresent in this circumstance. It was enough just to be there. And I said at the conclusion of the meal, I thanked them both because they both had substantial impact on my early life. The combination of these games and computer programming basically defined my life. And there were interesting things that came out through Fighting Fantasy Fest. This is why I'm going to record that in a separate podcast. But I was really very mindful that I was taking their time, and although I donated to take their time, I didn't want to cause them too much hassle. We did talk a little bit about what it's like to live in the US. I talked about the alligator in the basement a few doors down. I talked about how the whole narrative associated with assault weapons is just really curious. I didn't make the point, which I make periodically, that disarming the police would actually cause a reduction in shootings. Like the percentage of homicides that are caused by the police is higher, or roughly the same actually, it depends how you calculate it, but roughly the same as the percentage of homicides with assault weapons. And that, as a phenomena, indicates that the broadest method that people are killed through guns is handguns. And there's not a politician out there that talks about that. They talk about assault weapons. They don't talk about the police. They don't talk about gun buybacks. So the whole thing associated with the narrative of firearms in the US and the means of addressing that is just not given in any way, shape or form. So I talked a little bit about that, and Ian Livingstone in particular just returned to the standard narrative about assault weapons are bad. So I tried to make an effort. But I think that also indicates the nature of the conversation, that I was there as an entity. They talked a little bit about Netflix, obviously. I'll talk more about that in Fighting Fantasy Fest terms. But yes, it was just a privilege to sit with these men and have a meal with them and get a sense of who they were in some very superficial one lunch kind of thing. And I think what's interesting through Fighting Fantasy Fest is I probably had more connection with them in the panels that they gave through this thing. But Fighting Fantasy Fest was something very, very different than the lunch meeting. But I got there through the lunch meeting. And they said at the end of the lunch that there were, I think, another maybe 12 or 13 people who had paid for the meals. And what they were going to do was probably put them in groups together. So they'd do a dinner with maybe 3, dinner maybe 2 or 3, this kind of stuff. So I really was very lucky to catch them early on. Before, if I'd been with some other person who'd put in money for a meal, it probably wouldn't have been the same experience. And I was slightly jet lagged. I was slightly, not really present. And I didn't come to this thing with a notion of getting anything from it other than a few books signed and ability just to spend time in the company with these two men. So maybe I should have been more of a promoter. Maybe I should have talked a bit more about the stuff that I was doing. But it just didn't seem appropriate. The whole thing was just too good and too, I don't know, just a special thing that didn't need any additional kind of molestation, for want of a better term. So that was the meeting with Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. Underpromoted on my part, but just a real luxury.